tutorial on calculating slope. When we calculate slope, we typically use the slope formula, which is derived from what we know about slope, where slope is the equal to the rise over run, or the change in y over change in x. Now a change in y is simply computed by subtracting two y coordinates, and then the change in x is also computed the same way. So this breaks down into this, which is our slope formula. Our y2 minus y1 is simply our change in y. Our x2 minus x1 is our change in x. And m stands for slope. So now let's try using this formula. Our first example asks us to find the slope of a line that contains the point 5, 6, and 10, 2. Well, I'm going to call 5, 6 our first point, and 10, 2 our second point. This means that 5 is our x1, 6 is our y1, and then 10 is our x2, and 2 is our y2. So I'm going to plug these values into our formula, which looks like this. M is equal to y2 minus y1 all over x2 minus x1. So if I plug those numbers in, I end up with 2 minus 6 all over 10 minus 5. This becomes a negative 4 over 5. So my slope is negative 4 over 5. Now what if I had decided that this was my second point and this was my first point? Then this would become x2, and this would become y2, this would become x1, and this would become y1. Well, let's see what happens. Again, our m is equal to y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So y2 in this case would be equal to 6. Our y1 would be equal to 2. Our x2 would be equal to 5. And our x1 would be equal to 10. So we would end up with 4 over negative 5, or negative 4/5. I did this both ways to show you that it doesn't matter what order you put the points into this equation. As long as your 2's, your y2 and your x2, come from the same point, and your y1 and your x1 come from the other point. So let's try the next formula, or the next problem. Find the slope of a line that contains the points 1, 3, and 3, 9. So again, we're going to use our formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And I'm going to call this point 2 and this point 1. So we're going to end up with 9 minus 3 over 3 minus 1. This is going to become a 6, and this is going to become a 2. So the slope of the line that contains these 2 points has a slope of 3. Now let's see if we can use the slope formula to calculate slopes from a graph or a table. To calculate slopes from a graph, you simply just pick 2 points on the line. So let's pick this point, which is 2, 2, and this point, which is negative 1, negative 1. And we'll plug them into our formula. So again, our formula is m is equal to y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And I'm going to call this my second point and this my first point. So I'm going to start off with negative 1 minus 2 all over negative 1 minus 2. This is equal to negative 3 over negative 3. So the slope of this line is 1. Now let's try it from a chart. Pick any points in the chart. You only need 2. So I'm going to pick the first one and the third one. I'm going to plug it into my formula. M is equal to y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And I'm going to call this point 2 and this point 1. So we're going to start with 6 minus 12 over 9 minus 3. Here we're going to end up with a negative 6 over 6. So the slope of the function that's represented in this chart is negative 1. Lastly, let's see if we can use the slope formula to calculate the slope from these equations. Well, we need points to use the slope formula, which is m is equal to y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. But we don't have any points from these equations, so we're going to have to find them. Now, usually the easiest points to solve for are our intercepts, or our 0 points. So the first point we're going to solve for is when x is equal to 0. So if I plug in 0 for x, we'll get 4 times 0 plus 12y is equal to 24. This means that y is equal to 2. So our first point is going to be 0, 2. Next, we'll plug in 0 for y. So we end up with 4x plus 12 times 0 is equal to 24. This means that 4x is equal to 24, and our x is equal to 6. So the next point we're going to solve for, or we did solve for, is 6, 0. Now we'll plug these points into our slope formula. So m is equal to, and I'm going to call this one number 2 and this one number 1, 0 minus 2 over 6 minus 0. So we're going to end up with a negative 2 over 6. So the slope of the function represented by this equation is negative 1/3. Let's try this again on the next one. Again, the easiest ones to solve for are typically the zeros. So first I'm going to plug in 0 for x. So we'll get 30 times 0 plus 12y is equal to 60. That goes to 0. Divide by 12 on both sides, and you'll get y is equal to 5. So our first point is 0, 5. Now let's plug in 0 for y. So we get 30x plus 12 times 0 is equal to 60. This goes to 0. Let's divide both sides by 30. And we get x is equal to 2. So our next point is going to be 2, 0. So let's plug these into our slope formula. Again, this will be number 2, and this will be point 1. So we'll end up with 0 minus 5 over 2 minus 0, which is equal to negative 5 halves. So the slope of the function that's represented by this equation is negative 5 halves. And that completes the tutorial on calculating slope.